Hey, hi.
Hi, this is James Coleman. I'm a law professor at SMU's Dedman School of Law in Dallas, Texas.
And I am Guillermo Garcia Sanchez, and I am an associate professor of law at Texas A&M University School of Law.
And we're just going to talk for a little bit here about our new research project. The title of the project is Deep in the Heart of North America, Texas, and the Future of Energy Trade. And the idea for this research project is to look at some of the opportunities that improved energy technology has created for both to generate a lot of economic activity, economic wealth, and to power the economies in North America, focusing on Texas and Mexico, but looking more broadly at increasing energy links between throughout all of North America. So I think we're probably the reason for this research proposal, and the reason you have two law professors studying it, is that we are looking at some of the increased challenges to building the new energy trading links, whether it's the infrastructure or just having long-term contracts to sell some of the oil gas that have been unlocked by the fracking revolution, some of the wind and solar power that have been that are now increasingly prominent in the energy mix in North America because of falling prices of solar and wind power. And so we know that these new technologies have the opportunity to get the economy going, to lower prices, and increase the environmental performance, clean up the air, and clean up our energy systems. But the challenge is getting those to market because of some of the legal hurdles that are increasing to cross-border energy trade. And so I don't know, Cameron, do you want to talk about some of those challenges, and then I can chime in with some?
Right. So we're facing an unprecedented moment for international energy markets because if you think about it, just 10 years ago, it was unthinkable to see the North American region as an integrated energy region in itself. But that was partly because of Mexico's lack of capacity to integrate foreign investment into its energy sector. And by energy sector here, I don't only mean hydrocarbons, of course. I also mean power production because that wasn't possible before. But Mexico went through a very deep process for opening the markets to allow other participants to come in, and not only Pemex and CFE, who were that were the two state-owned companies. So that opened up a whole bunch of opportunities, both for Mexico, the U.S., and Canada to think as a region. And then we also had the
And that was just about 5 years ago, right?
right. That happened in 2013, 2014, and it was started to be implemented in Mexico. And then at the same time, we started having conversations about a new free trade agreement to replace the NAFTA that eventually passed the USMCA. And under that conversation, there was, I would say, a good moment in which both Mexico, the U.S., and the three of them, Mexico, U.S., and Canada, were actually thinking of having an energy chapter in the treaty that would foster this kind of investment, that would make us look like a region as opposed to be three separate markets competing against each other. But now, part of the research on why we're doing this grant is because we want to study what are the challenges now that things have changed, right? Everything was moving towards integration. Infrastructure was being built between Mexico and Canada, pipelines to bring LNG into Mexico and gas into Mexico to allow more energy production. Right now, we got to a point where almost 70% of the gas that was being consumed in Mexico came from the United States, and that tantamounted almost to 50% of the power production in Mexico was basically powered by gas coming from Texas, particularly.
And
So
that's incredibly important to Texas gas producers right now too, because the shale revolution has just revolutionized production of oil, but those oil wells typically produce associated gas as well. So there are unprecedented amounts of gas being produced in West Texas and the Permian Basin and the Eagle Ford Shale south of San Antonio, even closer to the border with Mexico. And so those producers desperately need markets for that gas. Right now, a lot of it is being just wasted, flared, burned off. But if it could get to those markets in Mexico that need natural gas to have increased power production and more reliable and cleaner power production, it would be great for Mexico, but from the Texas perspective, great for our producers and being able to sell it rather than just burn it off.
Right, and the same can be said about refineries in Houston, right? Mexico was importing almost 60, 70% of gasoline that was being used by regular Mexicans was being imported from refineries from Texas, particularly in the Houston area. And that's just because Mexico didn't have refinery capacity. Mexico doesn't have storage capacity. So there was a lot of potential. Actually, there is still a lot of potential for synchronizing the markets and working with the competitive advantages of each market. But now I think that's why it is important to study the new changes. And I can see, and I think James and I, we will at least identify three biggest changes. First, I would say definitely was the change of government in Mexico. The entry of Andrés Manuel López Obrador into Mexican politics has changed dramatically the view, at least from the Mexican state, on the value of having the U.S. market so close. The previous administration was thinking about integrating. I think the new administration is talking now about energy sovereignty. And that means basically insulating Mexico and making sure that Mexico is energy self-sufficient. And so that brings a lot of issues on board. I would say the second big challenge, and that's going to bring a lot of regulations, and a lot of the things that were being implemented now are putting on hold. I would say the second big challenge that we're facing is the crackdown on the global markets. This is something that, at least when we were presenting the grant, we didn't conceive at that point, but I think it's definitely going to be a game changer. With now COVID-19, the reduction of demand, the OPEC deal, all those different elements bring uncertainty into the market. And then,
right. I mean, this is the biggest destruction in world oil demand that has ever happened. So it's basically taking probably 20 million barrels a day of demand down, and that's created huge problems across North America and across the world. We see in Canada this morning, I believe Western Canadian Select prices for their heavy oil were below zero. So that's just it's a negative price for oil. It's not something you see very often, but it is definitely an unprecedented challenge. And the U.S. and Mexico have been at the center of that because Mexico has traditionally negotiated with the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, on cutbacks. But as Guillermo says, the priority of the current administration is increasing oil production, and so they didn't really want to cut back. And so a lot of that ongoing negotiation happened between the U.S. and Mexico because the U.S., for the first time in 50 years, the roles were reversed because the U.S. for 50 years has wanted OPEC to increase production, and now for the first time they're saying, well, we want to lower production a little bit because we need better prices for our producers, and that has led to this really interesting cross-border diplomacy between the U.S. and Mexico are at the center of these global negotiations.
Right, and that was I would say a seismic change in the global markets. I mean, the rise of the U.S. as a big producer, the rise of the U.S. as I would say up to 1950, probably 1950s, 60s, the U.S. was the biggest producer, but then it dropped as a big producer, and it was a big consumer, right? And so most of the rules that were set up in place, most of the treaties were set up in place, we're conceiving the U.S. more of an energy importer than an energy exporter. And now we see the opposite. Now it's Mexico is a big energy importer and the U.S. is a big energy exporter. So the U.S. has a big interest in now and regulating or having a greater impact on production to regulate prices or have an impact on the prices because that's affecting U.S. producers, not only consumers. And the big obsession with the U.S. 15, 20 years ago was how do we lower the price of gas, right? Because they were focusing only on consumers. But now I think the U.S. has this mixed feeling. At the same time, they're focusing on on consumers, but they are in big metropolitan areas. But also, you're trying to protect U.S. producers and keep them afloat. And so I would say that's another big change that is going to affect a lot of regulations. I would say the third one that is going to come up, and that James and I, so we've been talking about, is what is going to happen with the election in the U.S. And that might have a big impact on the way the U.S. perceives itself. There's a change in administration, and this is partly also, if you think about it, again, going back to the USMCA, that I think is connected to the 3 points. The USMCA, by not having a chapter on energy, left a lot of doors open for the states to change their minds, right? And that's going to affect investors' rights, and that's going to affect whatever investors were thinking is going to be definitely impacted by the change of politics. One of the advantages always of having treaties in place is that it gives at least a framework that tries to insulate government policies from politics. And Mexico and the United States and Canada failed, I would say, with the USMCA to give that uncertainty.
Yeah, well, Guillermo, obviously you do a lot of research about how investors think about these bilateral investment treaties, which typically say, well, government, if you want to change a law, maybe you can, but if you do it in a discriminatory way, or you do it in a way that destroys my property, basically confiscates my property, you might have to go to arbitration and you may have to pay me for it. And that, being that system, which existed in NAFTA, being somewhat gutted, is definitely a potential challenge for investors going forward. Although you've done research on why, even if the government might have to pay to change its regulations, it still might do that anyway. But yeah, I think that's a big issue in particular because there are signs that regulation may be changing at the federal level and change dramatically. So we saw already a dramatic shift with President Obama taking 7 years to look at the Keystone XL decision and then ultimately rejecting it. And then the second day in office, President Trump saying, hey, State Department, look at that Keystone XL pipeline again, maybe we'll approve it. And here we are 3 years later, and that is still caught up in courts with deep uncertainty about whether it will ultimately be approved. Basically, the court struck down one approval that the Trump administration had given, and now the Trump administration has given another approval. We don't know if that will stand. One of the big open questions about that is for some of these pipelines, like the oil pipelines, Congress has never passed a statute that gives the president authority over this. So if the president does this under his executive power discretion, and there's a question if there's no law, are there any judicial limits that are on this discretion? Presumably, if there are not, that means next president could step in and say, well, I don't care what President Trump thought I'm going to do. I'm going to cancel all these pipelines. And it's interesting because it might, in theory, apply it to existing pipelines as well, because those permits, in theory, could be revoked at any time. So there's a huge amount of uncertainty, in part because we don't actually know even what the former Vice President Biden's policies would be if you were a new president on pipelines. So there's a lot of uncertainty about each of these steps. And one other thing our project will go into is that in the U.S. there's also increased uncertainty about whether states are going to approve pipelines and power lines that are basically exporting energy. Right. So if we have more solar power produced in Texas or in Arizona, and Mexico wants to use that to clean up its grid, are those states going to say, nope, you don't get to build that because we're not going to build a power line across our landowners' land to serve our users in Mexico, right? And that's happening with natural gas pipelines. It's happening with oil pipelines. So there's just there are a number of uncertainties across a number, whether it's at the U.S. federal level, the U.S. state level, in Mexico, and also, because we're talking about North American energy, also a lot of uncertainty in Canada. So these are very big issues. And another area that I think we've both written in is rights of indigenous peoples, and those rights are currently the contours of those rights are being shaped by the courts and also interpretation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which plays a bigger role potentially in some discussions in Canada and also in Mexico. And so this is, it's a real, there are profound uncertainties across all these levels.
Right, and that is why it's fascinating when you think about it in terms of a region, right? Because for example, Mexico's oil fields, many of them are located in indigenous lands, right? You're talking about Tabasco, you're talking about Veracruz, you're talking about Chiapas, you're talking about Campeche, and there are communities there that are going to be affected, right? But if we could actually import energy from Texas, right, that is already producing the gas, you don't have to deal about the fracking in Mexico, which is very controversial. The current administration, they don't want to do any type of fracking. So anything has to do with shale gas or shale oil, it's off the books. But if you want to bring it to metropolitan areas in the North Mexico, like Monterrey, which is a big powerhouse of production, of industrial production, it's easier to bring it and less costly, and it impacts less communities if you bring that from Texas, right, into Monterrey, which is just a couple of miles down, up closer to the border, as opposed to having to build infrastructure that crosses indigenous lands from the south of Mexico into Monterrey, right? The same can be said about. Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, it's just there's a lot of reasons why thinking of North America as a region, as a power region, and then you can have all the excess of production. You can export it as a region, right? And one of the interesting things that is been happening now is that you see people starting to talk: should Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. behave as a bloc when it comes to negotiate with OPEC? Are there opportunities now that the U.S. is willing to engage into that leadership when you can actually have a broader impact as a region when it comes to negotiating, for example, with Russia and Saudi Arabia, which was a big deal in the last, and it's one of the reasons why we have now an oversupply, because they went into a power fight on production, and they expanded it right in the moment where COVID-19 was hitting the economies and demand was collapsing. Saudi Arabia and Russia were actually expanding production, and that dropped the prices to where we are today.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, just even if you look at a small level or a big level, there's incredible opportunity for more integration. On the small level, look at all the refineries in Texas and on the U.S. Gulf Coast are made to handle heavy sour crude, because they were made to handle that oil, that heavy sour crude from Venezuela, from Canada. But they also work great with that heavy sour crude from Mexico.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the oil that's being produced, the oil and gas that's being produced in Texas is very light, with a lot of gas, a lot of light oil. That works better with the refineries that Mexico has. Great for producing gasoline, which obviously Mexico imports a lot of it, and also that natural gas for serving those industrial consumers and increased power demand across northern Mexico for manufacturing, et cetera. So there's a lot of things in the market pushing for greater integration. But as you say, because of this sort of notion of energy sovereignty, we want to produce all of our own. We don't want to be importing, exporting. That's potentially a challenge to achieving that integration. The other thing I'd say is exactly what you pointed out. So Mexico for years has worked with exporting countries on maintaining reasonable prices for oil and gas. Canada probably, if it did what was in its economic interest, would also have been doing that for 50 years.
Right.
But it hasn't, because it's awkward. It'd been awkward for it politically to do so when its closest ally was the United States, that was deadly opposed to OPEC. Now that OPEC and the U.S. are working together, it's a great opportunity for Canada to get on board. So we're actually seeing, more close alignment of these three countries than really has ever existed before, because they're both consume a lot of energy, produce a lot of energy, net exporters. They could work together to achieve some huge benefits from that in terms of local markets and efficiency of the use of our refineries and markets for our producers, but also in terms of diplomacy and geopolitics. Moving together, that's an incredibly powerful bloc.
Yeah, and that's why the research that we're doing is so exciting, and we're so thankful for the Texas-Mexico Center to be funding it. And hopefully in the next months, we will be interviewing people both in Mexico and the U.S. and Texas that are involved in these policy decisions. We're going to be talking to practitioners that are talking that work for some of the companies, and hopefully we'll be talking to regulators. So this is a fascinating time to doing this research, and again, we are very thankful for the center's support, and we look forward to presenting a report soon.
Absolutely. Thank you.